making that connection. Let's get down. Let's hang out together. Let's get down. Let's get down. Get away for a while. Sooner than later. I'm right here, ready to go. Got me takeaway. Looking for direction, making that connection. I'm right here, I'm ready to go. You got me takeaway. Looking for direction, making that connection. Let's get down. Let's get down. Inside you know there's something wrong. You don't know how to deal with it. I'm sorry that my words were cold. They seem to make you shiver within. Let's turn it around, babe. 'Cause it's getting us down. Let's turn it around, babe. 'Cause it's getting us down. Tell my eyes to stop making things up, because it's only gonna bring you down. And baby, if you only knew that.
Get up on your feet, get up off your backside. Got to get up off your knees, get up off your backside. Waiting in line is not for me. Get up off your backside. I got to get just what I need. Get up off your backside. Get up off your backside. You got to get up off your backside. Come on, stand up, come on, stand up. Get up off your backside. You got to get up off your backside.
Sometimes enough is enough. Sometimes you can't keep on trying. One sign, step back to the beginning. Your heart sings for attention, ready to unfold. Your heart is ready to unfold. Your heart is ready to unfold. Your heart is ready to unfold. Open your heart, it's ready to unfold. Hold it until tomorrow morning. Close your eyes and sleep till you. Sold everything you've got, all your forces under the sun. Put the corn up into the sky. I take you one by one by one. Come on and take me on. 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 Your words are like throwing stones, skipping across my skin. Take one look at what has gone before. There's no way you will ever win. Come on and take me on. 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 'Cause when the war is over, the fight is done. Well, I'll be lying in the sun. And when the war is over, the fight is done. Well, I'll be lying in the sun.
To me, it makes me feel fine. Every little word that you say to me keeps my heart on time. Red blood flowing like a rough rapid when you are nearby. Ain't no doubt, 'cause it's plain to see you set us so fire. Something so true is what I get from you, and I hope that you'll see get the best of me. Something so true is what I get from you, and I hope that you'll see you get the best of me. Most generous love you spread around to the people in your life, sharing their weight and their pressure just to make it right. I hope one day that you get it back if the karma stuff is true. Here's a little song just to make a start, called Something So True. Something so true is what I get from you, and I hope that you'll see you get the best of me. Something so true is what I get from you, and I hope that you'll see you get the best of me. Ooh-wee.
gift to me. It makes me feel fine. Every little word that you say to me keeps my heart on time. Red blood flowing like a rough rapid when you are nearby. Ain't no doubt, 'cause it's plain to see you set us so fire. Something so true is what I get from you, and I hope that you'll see you get the best of me. Something so true is what I get from you, and I hope that you'll see you get the best of me. Ooh-wee. Most generous love you spread around to the people in your life, sharing their weight and their pressure just to make it right. I hope one day that you get it back if the karma stuff is true. Here's a little song just to make a start, called Something So True. Something so true is what I get from you, and I hope that you'll see you get the best of me. Something so true is what I get from you, and I hope that you'll see you get the best of me. Ooh-wee. Oh yeah, something so true is what I get from you, and I hope that you see you get the best of me. Something so true is what I get from you, and I hope that you see you get the best of me. Ooh-wee. It's so true. It's so true. It's so true. It's so true. Let's get down. Let's get down. Let's hang out together. Ooh, let's get down. Let's get down and take a ride somewhere, sometime. Ooh, let's get down. Let's get down and get away for a while, sooner than later. I'm right here, ready to go. Got me takeaway, looking for direction, making that connection. I'm right here, ready to go. Got me takeaway.
Table for me. All right, good evening. Hi everybody and welcome to the Court Theatre. Thank you very much for coming along, and I'd like to introduce you to Kiwi Tech. So this is our little brand of seminars that was started. It's really cute, and he's got a hat. and stuff. So KiwiTech is an initiative by ETNZ about creating a lot of little seminars like this that we're web streaming and then hosting on YouTube afterwards. So tonight's KiwiTech is on fire, and we have 3 presenters. So we've got Anthony Leland from Fireworks Professionals to talk about pyro. We have Dean Phillip from John Herber and New Zealand Fire Shield to talk about fireproofing, and Angela Chen from the Institution of Fire Engineers. We're going to make a start shortly. Very quickly first, if you haven't been to this venue before, evacuation. If an alarm goes off, we're going to head out through the main doors and assemble at the far side of the car park. If you see smoke or fire, that would be very ironic. There is a call point behind both of the 2 bars. So we're going to make a start, and I'll welcome Anthony up.
So my name's Anthony Leland, for those of you who don't know, and Leland rhymes with New Zealand, and it's spelled almost the same way. I am a test certifier under the present legislation. On December the 1st, I'll be, I've got to read it now, a compliance certifier. And anyone who's an approved handler will now be a certified handler. So anyone who, a lot of the certified handlers for class 2, 3, 4, and 5 will drop out. Anyway, that's by the by. So indoor pyrotechnics. A particular class of pyrotechnics that's defined by the regulations, and it can be used indoors or outdoors, or indeed it can be used by executant performers. So I might have a fire staff with fools on this, twirling it around, showering myself with sparks, and showering the punters with sparks, and doing all sorts of tricks with it. And it's becoming quite a popular fashion now. There's a Spanish group coming over for Christmas for that. So the legislation, now we may have a wee problem here. Where is that mouse gone? Can you, hiding there. Come on. Okay, so you go to 3W's legislation.govt.nz, and you go to advanced search, and you click on legislative instruments. I already need some glasses here. I'll have a fish in my pocket. And then you type an approximate heading of the title in for this. Now so it's the health and where are we? Sorry about this. And so we can go and scroll down through them. Health and Safety at Work Act, Health and Safety at Work, Hazardous Substance Regulations. And then search for indoor. And it has brought up, indoor appeared 31 times in 20 clauses. Oh my God, but it's actually quite straightforward. Keep on scrolling down and go to controls on indoor pyrotechnic displays, and that will tell you a lot about it. And I won't go further and further into that, but it's a very straightforward way of addressing the regulations. So if someone hands you a load of bollocks about something, you can go straight to the regulations very easily and look it up. Right, how do we get out of that? We close the screen, I guess. Right, so now you know how to find the regulations. There is no code of practice. Code of practice has vanished with the new regulations. There needs to be one. But if you want to get a good code of practice, get the NFPA one. That's the National Fire Prevention Association in America one. So do you need pyro? You know, like you might be able to get something pretty, and you put your own label on it, and wow. And there's no pyro. And you might be able to say, well, oh, well, no, but I want to do it electrically. And you might be able to do it electrically. So it's not necessary to actually run pyro. And the problems of running pyro, having insurance, all those sort of things, you can get by. Years and years ago, I gave school some tubes and they put corn flour in them, and a little hole on the side and a cork in the end. They were fitted with a butt, so they looked like a gun, and they went, blew the corn flour out the end, and they flashed the lights at the same time, and everyone thought they were shooting guns on the stage. It was all done with corn flour in a plastic tube. So is the management agreeable? You know, will there be a mess? Yes. Smoke detection management. Now that's major. You need to talk to fire service about it. You need to talk to the engineers who designed the system. You need to talk to the building engineers. They might arrange the air conditioning so all the smoke goes roaring out the fly tower, or it might go roaring into another part of the building where the smoke isn't turned off and set the alarm off. One Wellington venue, an overseas group came in and looked at it and said, "Oh, it's too filthy up there, we're not firing any pyro, bugger you." I think it was Katy Perry, you know. So if there's crap and muck where the pyro is being fired, it's not wise to fire it. Under the stage, spark's going to drop under the stage if you've got rising and falling stages. Curtains examined and certified and vacuumed. And have you got the budget for the talent? Because when you've got talent like that and it starts with a dark stage, and you've got to be sure as hell they're in the right place before you press the button, or you could fry someone. At that very show, we had the Television New Zealand guys running around leaning over the pyro holding their cameras. It was very, very scary. So your plan and the changes, you decide on a plan and you incorporate changes allowing for the director. You submit this to Fire and Emergency New Zealand, that's the fire service, to the fire safety officers. Really difficult to get hold of them nowadays because there's a sort of, you've got to send it to the top and they filter it down. Get to know your local fire safety officer, send one to the top, but send one to him. So it's generally him, I don't think there's any ladies. And they're really helpful guys. They'll give you all sorts of useful cues. Enter into discussions with them about it, and notify WorkSafe 3 days beforehand. Okay? And you must have certified handlers, and they hold a controlled substance license, which is a thing like a driver's license or a gun license. So if you don't have one of those on site, the pyro's got to be locked up. And there we are, we've said that. So you've drawn up a plan. Now this plan here, oh bugger, sorry. This plan here shows an area where the pyro sparks will fall, and an area twice that radius as an extra safety. So we've got pyro in 4 places here on this. We've got a discharge area, as a centre bit's called, where all the sparks will land, and an exclusion zone around it. You're saying where the fire extinguishers are and the hose reels, where the firing point is, and what the talent is doing. And we've got fire wardens left and right with extinguishers. So you can see why you need this sort of precaution, because, where did that mouse go? Oh, there it is. Oh, go back. Took me ages to work out it was my granddaughter standing in the corner there. See, she's right down there and she's pressing the button. So now you've seen enough of that to realise, you know, you actually need a clearly defined discharge area that you're not going to set anything on fire, and extra isolation just in case. So rehearsals, by the way, can someone keep an eye on the time? I've got 20 minutes, and if I'm blatting on too long, okay? Give me a 5-minute call, please. Thanks, Sam. length and intensity for the situation. You might have an event where there's a CEO coming in to press the button to announce, the new building's opened, and he's too important to actually come for a rehearsal. So even though the legislation says you've got to have a rehearsal, well, you just rehearse it with everyone but him, so everyone knows what's happening, and he's told, you stand there and press that button. And there is also aspects of people will never say in a speech what they meant to say, like, I declare the building open. And I press the button, you press the button then. They're pretty hopeless about that. So you need someone from the organisation to cue you. The essential element is a view of where the pyro is and where the talent is. And you've got to be absolutely sure of the clearance. And there's many techniques which I won't talk about today to position the talent on the stage. I mean, one basic one is using a couple of lasers, and when you can see the little dots on their back, you know they're in the right place. So that's executant pyro. So there's a couple of dancers there. They've got fireworks on their fingertips which burn for a minute, and they're whirling around in a dance. There's another one of executant pyro. That lady there, there were two minders for her. There was one to rig her and set her in place, and there was a second minder to give her the pyro armed, because she's obviously not going to turn the key on just before while she's standing up there, so it has to be handed to her armed. And that person also has a wet towel, because if a spark comes down her naked arm, it could be a little bit unpleasant. She was told, you might get a spark down your arm, it'll tingle a bit, don't jump, and we'll put a wet cloth on it afterwards. So what pyro can you use? It's certified by a manufacturer for indoor use. Now, we manufacture some, but actually we've gone to importing a lot of pyro because we can get a much wider range from the United States, and it's very high quality. It's not to say that ours is bum quality, but they produce a very wide range of high quality stuff for Rolling Stones, AC/DC, Guns N' Roses, Disney on Ice, and so we get the offshoot of that stuff, which is, it's quite good. It's supplied with a data sheet showing the clearance distances. It's supplied with an SDS, that's a safety data sheet, which is what people call an MSDS, but it's an SDS these days, a 16.1. You never modify the pyrotechnics without talking to the manufacturer. I mean, if you clip the base off or you alter the ignition or something like that, you could do something quite drastic. So they're physically and chemically and pyrotechnically made to be a certain way, so you don't change them. Now, if you wanted to make your own, and many theatres did in New Zealand in the past, under the present regulations, you need a manufacturing location certificate, and that you need certification on your controlled substance license so that you're certified for manufacture. So there's a data sheet, and we'll go close into it. And it's a fire finger. You can't read all of that there, but we'll just tell you a bit about it. It's a fire finger, and that fire finger tube there is put on someone's finger, and they have a little igniter system. It fires a little ball of fire out. And it says specifically it's not a device with precision accuracy. It's slightly self-propelling as it goes because it's burning, so it could go over a certain envelope of operation as we describe it. So from here it's quite clearly you don't be in front of it, but if I fired it over there, I would not really like to take that lady fire engineer out. Yeah, back a bit further please. That's it. Horses for courses, that's why you have a test with a talent, or numerous tests with a talent and rehearsals. Oops. So what are personnel qualifications? If you go to apply for a controlled substance license, you've got to be a fit and proper person. Well, I feel very fit and proper. I sail and I dance, but no, that's not it. You get a police check, and it's more exhaustive than a gun license check. You look at your political background, whether you voted National or Labour or for Gareth Morgan. you can argue about it. And one guy who lost his controlled substance license said, well, right, he did a stupid thing, he paid the fine, he lost his license, he wants it back. And he got it back. Or someone else who'd done something silly while they were drunk and beat the shit out of someone when they were 17, and the police wouldn't give him a controlled substance license. And he said, I'm 42, I've been running a business for the last 24 years. I think I deserve a break. And the police said, okay. So I want to talk a bit about the DMX-controlled LPG flame gear that you can get, and also stuff that burns coloured liquid fuels in film canisters. That's a bunch of it that we had there. It fires out LPG with DMX, and you know how highly accurate and precise DMX is, that it will never malfunction. So after a while of playing with that, we went, nah, we're not having it. I mean, having something sitting there like that in a nice row, and you know, the talent of walking around the stage and saying, what's this? And suddenly there's a DMX blip and it fires. It's horrifying stuff. You can get really expensive stuff from the US. That's $400 a unit. They're about $4,000 a unit from the US. The ones that burn liquid fuel in things like gas canisters just don't have anything to do with them. One of them just sitting there just went and started spewing the fuel out. We have no idea why it did it. And burning. So if you want to, where did I put my briefcase? I'm sure oh, there it is. If you decide that you want to use live guns on stage, and you haul, and somebody says, yeah, I've got something like this, yeah, and that you say, is it a real gun? And that, yeah. Unless they're an armourer with a theatrical armourer's license, you do not have anything to do with them. Quite frankly, there was a guy killed on a set by people using a live gun there, and I won't go on the long detailed story, but it finally ended up with a bullet jammed partway down the barrel because a very low powered blank had been fired, and then someone put a high powered blank in and went and shot him dead. So I don't recommend real guns at all, and any fake gun has got to be designed so it can't actually fire something across the stage. Now, you can use indoor pyro outdoors, and that was one we did absolutely ages back. You see the crowd's so close, the mayor was waving a staff around to be like a magician or something like that with pyro on it, people everywhere. You have to use indoor pyro outdoors, which you can do. It's permitted under the law. I spent something like 4 years convincing them to allow us to use indoor pyro outdoors. And because it's so precise, it's a very nice controlled way of doing it. You can also use it on things like, you know, a Christmas tree, but of course you really need to know how well that Christmas tree will burn. And I did it by just getting down the bottom with a fire extinguisher and a cigarette lighter and checking it in somewhere that I didn't notice, just to see what it was like, because you imagine setting the whole Christmas tree on fire and dripping molten plastic everywhere. So that's me for the moment, but I can go back over any of those points and answer any questions.
So we're going to we'll do a combined question and answer session at the end with all three presenters. We'll do a combined question and answer at the end with all three.
States that any flexible fabric in our environments, our venues, our public venues, needs to have what they call a flammability index of 12 or less. A flammability index is a measurement from a test called AS 1530 Part 2, and that assigns an index based on its burn rate for fabrics. So, rule of thumb across the board, all fabrics are required to be a flame index of 12 or less. So new fabrics and old fabrics, or anything that you're bringing into the place, are required to come under that code. And with that code, what we have is another lovely piece of legislation, which is the durability. and that dictates to us how often we need to do this and maintain it. I can read you a couple of excerpts from it for the way of maintenance, but basically rule of thumb again is on a 5-yearly rotation, because the items are easily replaced or accessible. They're required to be maintained and to keep up the standard of the flame retardancy of any fabrics put in. There's a lot of things that will degrade flame retardancy or the fabrics, mostly humidity and dust and the buildup of dust, and hence why a good maintenance cycle is required for your venues. We recommend when we produce a product, our draperies we hand out, we also give a producer statement and a care and maintenance document as well, which dictates the manufacturer's maintenance, which is annual cleaning, which can be done by your own staff any time. And on a 5-yearly rotation, we would come along and then also clean these drapes and add a booster of flame retardant product to it. So the maintenance basically is a standard that comes through, and it's where applicable, following manufacturer's maintenance recommendations, recoating of interior and exterior protective finishings for items that are easily, I'll find the right wording for you on that one. Building elements, including linings and renewable protective coatings and fixtures, easy to access and replace, to be a minimum of 5 years. So we actually have to certify our product when we do it for 5 years, and that's why we sit with a 5-year rotation. And I'm sure a lot of you guys have all seen the buildup of dust that can accumulate in a venue, and also a lot of heat sources around. You'll find that if you're not regularly checking things like your draperies, you'll find burn marks and scorch marks on it. So care and maintenance is a big thing that we get asked about. How often should we do it? Well, ourselves, for our own company, we'll come in and do a major job for a lot of venues on a 5-yearly rotation, but something that you guys should be installing. A lot of times you'll have down periods and down times where you do your own maintenance. That's when you sort of want to bring in your drapes and just a standard vacuum cleaner and vacuum dust out of it. Check it for any loose hems or any burn or scorch marks that might be there from shows that you haven't seen, especially on all of your borders, where right close to all your lighting. Check for frayed edges, torn edges, anything like that. That's just part of your care and maintenance cycle, which you just put into a 12-month rotation. And any products that are produced or put into your venue should be labelled from the manufacturer that it is current with the certification, how long it lasts for, generally what type of material it was from and when it was manufactured, when it expires. And then for the likes of ourselves, when we go through in a 5-yearly rotation, we'll actually renew that labelling, so that, and then also issue you with paperwork so that you've got for your files, or the health and safety these days, everyone's sort of cross the T's and dot the I's. And you should be able to walk around your venue and at the bottom hem, check everything that you've got, that you're up to date from there. What else can I give you a rundown on? We also get asked about fireproofing for sets. Now, currently to my knowledge, there is no legislation in the Building Act regarding sets, because it's not actually a fixed or adhered part or a regular part of the building. However, venues and best practice guides will also dictate what you should and shouldn't have flame retardant. Obviously, the best way to be as proactive as you can be, but there's no need to go overboard either, where everything needs to be flame retardant or have a product added to it. A lot of your harsh, your hard timbers and your plywoods and so forth, I use plywood as a welding bench, so it's something that is not going to burn away in a set. However, if you've got highly flammable or products that are going to be light materials or papers or anything like that that can be flame retardant, should be flame retardant. And a lot of venues will just take a blanket across the board and say everything that comes in here needs to be flame retardant. But then you could sit back and say, well, okay, well, this, and this shouldn't need to be, but we're taking precautions for so forth. And same goes with costumes and so forth. You don't, flame retardancy on costumes is not really recommended unless you happen to be in an environment where you're going to be doing pyrotechnics or so forth, and you're going to be exposed to these sorts of flames. And will also launder out, so it needs to be continually reapplied and so forth. And that's where you can come to us for advice and things on how often you should do it. And the other thing too, I guess, is when you're using a product, there's multiple products around the world available for different purposes. Some of them will do natural and synthetics, some of them will do a lot more difficult products like foams and create foam barriers, what's called intermescence, where it creates a char barrier, it degrades and creates a barrier which protects it from the heat. Other products like our own absorbs into the material and increases the ignition point of the material or the product, like paper and material and timbers. But whatever product you're using, you should be able to go back through the product, track its testing, see that it's been well tested, well used. Other people in the industry may have used it in the past. It should have, again, things like MSDSs, all your handling and health and safety paperwork to go along with it, so that you know that you're not just using something that someone's whipped up in the backyard. I guess pretty much that's covers about everything I've got to say. Not nearly as long as anybody else's, but with a question and answer afterwards. So.
Sure. Thank you, Dean. So next up we've got Angela Chen from the Institution of Fire Engineers, the New Zealand chapter of it. Thanks, Angela.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, I don't have any flashy kind of toys as well to show, so it's just me talking about boring regulations. So bear with me and try to stay awake. For today's presentation, I'm going to briefly cover the relevant fire safety legislative requirements in New Zealand for performance venues and cover some of the special considerations for building owners and operators, including smoke alarm isolations and some exit blockage as well. So before I go into the detail, you might be wondering where all these legislative requirements come from. Actually, if you compare them around the globe, globally, the general rules and considerations are actually very similar. They are all based on two major fires, the lessons learned from two major fires in the past, and then slowly evolved over time with some local considerations added to the local building codes. So in New Zealand, there are two major pieces of legislations relating to fire safety. The first one is the New Zealand Building Code. It was mentioned in the previous presenter as well. It governs all the building safeties, overall safeties, not just limiting to fire. It's regulated by the councils through building consent process. The second one is fire safety and evacuation of buildings and regulations. This piece of legislation is more focused on the day-to-day operations of a building. And it's regulated by the fire service. Now it's called Fire Emergency New Zealand. And it's worth to know that both of this legislation, actually the focus is just on life safety, not property protection. So even though you meet the building code requirements, it doesn't necessarily mean that the fire loss could be is actually minimized. Okay. So in terms of meeting building code requirements, in New Zealand for fire safety, there's 3 different compliance routes that you can choose. There's performance-based design, the verification method, and acceptable solutions. That ranges from CAS1 to CAS7 that covers basically most type of buildings. For performance venues, the applicable one is called CAS4, which covers all the public access and educational facilities, such as this one here. Because of the time limit, I won't be able to cover every single requirements in that document, so I'll just touch on the key requirements. If you're interested to know the details, you can actually download the document from MB's website. So as I say, because the CAS4 and the building code requirement is limiting, is focused on the life safety. So all the fire safety requirements actually link back to how many people you have within the space. So the first thing that we need to determine is how many people we have. Obviously, the more people you have within a space, the more requirement there will be. When we're looking at occupant loads for a performance venue, it's not just the audience or the seating numbers in that space. You obviously should consider the performance on the stage as well, the seating, the audience, the technicians, the staff members, the ushers, every single person in that space, basically. And once we have the occupant load number together with the building scale, then based on CAS4, we can determine what type of fire safety systems we need to provide for that space. For example, if you have 200 people, then the requirement is just to provide a type 2 detection system, which is just the manual call points by the exit doors. If you have 1,000 people, then you need to start considering to put in sprinklers, the automatic smoke detection system, and also stage smoke venting as well. It's also worth to note that even though the building code or CAS4 requires for smoke detection system for when you meet certain criteria, but there's actually exemptions allowed if your environment is challenging for smoke detections. Say, for example, if your theater is constantly going to have shows involving smoke, then it's probably no point to have a smoke detector inside and every single day you have to isolate that system. So this is something that you need to, before the system is installed or before the building is designed, you need to communicate with your fire engineer on exactly what the building, what the space is going to be used for, what type of show is likely to be hosted there, and how often there will be shows involving smoke. Another requirement is if you have more than 500 people, then there will be a requirement to provide fire separation between the stage area and the seating area. This is because majority of the fire load will be on the stage area, and the likelihood of fire occurring on the stage area is higher as well. So providing that fire separation actually protects most of the people, which is at the seating side of the space. One other major item is obviously the surface finish and the fireproofing of materials, but it's already covered in very detail by the previous presenter, so I won't be repeating again. So in terms of means of escape, there are several items to consider. The travel distance, the number of exits that you have for the space, the capacities that you have, and the seating arrangement. All of this actually link back to the type of systems that you have for that space. And then again, ties back to how many people you have as well. So for example, when we're looking at travel distance, you have to consider how far does people have to travel from the most remote point in that space to a final exit. If your building or your space is provided with smoke detection system that's able to provide an earlier warning for the people, so the travel distance that under the code is actually allowed to be extended slightly because they have like earlier warning. If your building is provided with sprinkler system, then the sprinkler could be able to control the fire or even suppress the fire, then the travel distance is allowed to be extended even more. Yeah. Another consideration is number of exits. Unless the space has less than 50 people, then the general rule of thumb is you need to have a minimum of 2 exits for every single room or every single space. This is just in case of a fire located so close to an exit, people will still have another way to go out. And when we are calculating the number of exits, the 2 doors need to be positioned farther away as a minimum of 8 meters apart for them to be considered as 2 different exits. So this is just in case a fire that's so big in the middle, taking out 2 exits at the same time, obviously. So yeah, that's on the number of exits. In terms of capacities, general rule of thumb to do calculation is 7 millimeter per person if you're traveling horizontally, and 9 millimeter per person if you travel vertically on the stairs. But however, it's worth to note that if your building is not sprinklered, then the largest exit actually needs to be discounted when you do that calculation. This is because if a fire taken out of the exit, it's assumed in the worst case, like take out the largest exit, then we still need to provide enough capacity for other people to go out. And if your building is sprinklered, then the building code assumes that because the sprinkler system will be able to control the fire or even suppress the fire, so the exit, even though the fire could be close to it, people can still use it for egress. Another consideration is the seating arrangements. There's limitations on the maximum number of seats you can have per row. This is again linking to considerations of how fast can people leave that seating area. This is all tied into how you arrange the seats. For example, the wider walkways you have in between the seat, each row of seating, then people can walk through those walkways faster or easier. Then you can have slightly more number of seats per row. Or if you have aisles on both sides of sitting rather than just one side, then people can go both directions, then you can have more seats as well. For loose seating, it's only allowed to be positioned on level floor like this one. And if it's more than 250, the loose seating is actually required to be interconnected. This is just to prevent accidental overturn of the seats so that people can egress that smoothly. So let's on the building code and CS4 requirements that covers the requirements on the hardware side of things. The other one that we're going to look at is more on the software side of things, which is the evacuation regulations. The evacuation regulations covers requirements like, for example, it's the owner's responsibility to maintain the means of egress. For example, the egress route should not be blocked at all times. The exit doors should not be locked, obviously. There should not be any storage on the side of the stairs, so that the stair could be taken out by any accidental fires. Staff members should have a proper training so that each member should know in an emergency what's their role, what do they supposed to do, how do they direct people to egress. Another major part for performance venue is the management action upon a confirmed alarm. So upon a confirmed alarm, the management needs to stop the show right away. This is very crucial because the audience, majority of the audience sitting there will not be aware of the environment, and they are maybe not that familiar with the show as well. So in extreme cases, even though there's fire on the stage, they might be thinking that it's part of the show and not realizing the danger and start to evacuate. Also, one major thing under the evacuation regulation is there's the requirement for any spaces that has gathering of more than 100 people to have an approved evacuation scheme. This evacuation scheme basically needs to cover how is the fire going to be detected within a space, how is the audience going to be notified of a fire. Once they are notified, what's the evacuation procedure, where does people supposed to go, where is the final place of safety for people to go to. So, and also in order to ensure this kind of evacuation scheme is an ongoing kind of live document rather than just something that you're putting in the application form. That's also the requirements to either provide a trial evacuation every 6 months or evacuation training program. So like making sure the staff member for that building is familiar with all these requirements and the evacuation procedures. So let's on the evacuation regulation. Let's talk about the special considerations. A common issue for performance venue is the need or the use of special effects that's likely to trigger some false alarm. So the New Zealand standard 4512 actually has the allowance for installation of owner's isolation facilities. So in case of any predictable false alarm, like if you're going to have theatrical smoke within the space, that's definitely going to set off the smoke alarm system, then you are allowed to temporarily isolate the smoke detection. But however, this is only allowed for smoke detectors in a sprinklered building. This is because once the smoke detectors are isolated, you still need to have the second layer of defense, which is the sprinkler system if anything goes wrong. And this type of isolation is only allowed for smoke detector, not heat detection system or manual detection or any type of other type of detections, which is not so likely to have false alarm. To do this isolations, then obviously you need to let your alarm monitoring company know beforehand. You need to let them know when is this isolation going to happen, how long is that going to be isolated for, and what's the means to make sure that the system will be put back on live afterwards, after the show. So before you install this type of owner's isolation facilities, it's encouraged for you to have a consultation with all the relevant parties, including your fire engineer, the councils, Fire Emergency New Zealand as well. Another major issue for performance venue is the need to have temporary stage or show sets or decorations or something that could potentially block an exit. So when we're talking about blocking an exit, it's not necessarily just having that show set right in front, physically blocking that door. We should also consider that the potential blockage of line of sight for people to see an exit or an signage as well in terms of an emergency. So in this kind of situation, the consideration should be how is life safety still going to be ensured for that space. So once an exit door, for example, once an exit door is blocked, what's the capacity still left for that space and how many people do I have? So you can base on that 7 millimeter per person to do a rough calculation to see whether the leftover exits is still available enough for people to egress. And also the consideration should be if I'm temporarily blocking some exits or blocking the line of sight, what's the mitigation measures that I can put in? For example, you could probably consider putting in more staff members to help people directing the correct egress way as well. So because every single building is actually different, every show is different, that has different type of fire loads inside, they have different type of fire system. So it's really hard to give a one solution that applies to all. So if you're not sure, you encourage your place, feel free to contact Fire Emergency New Zealand for advice. That's my presentation. Thank you.
You might have to wrangle that microphone. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Angela. That was great. So that brings us to question and answers. So we've had a little bit of feedback off the internet along with some buffering issues, but we're dealing with that. So, so are there any questions here? If you've got a question, because we are web streaming it, we ask you to use a microphone, which Grant's modelling nicely at this point. Thanks, Boz. Thanks, Boz.
Question for the fire engineer. Just around fire exits and how far away a blockage can be. Are there rules on the inside the building side of the exit and on the outside of the exit? I know around stages we often end up with things parked around fire exits. Are there some rules around that?
Generally, in order to consider as an available egress route, the minimum width required for accessible people is 1.2 meters. So the minimum that you need to provide is 1.2 meters in front of the door so that people can still use that. Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries.
And leading on from that question, we had another question come through. In the case of tables and so on, if you've got like a dinner type event and there's tables quite close to a doorway, how do we get around the issue of chairs? Because obviously we may have a dinner for potentially 500 guests on a flat floor where there's loose chairs and many obstructions around tables. Do we need to take into consideration any egress from in aisles for table type events and with loose chairs?
Generally, when this type of planes comes in, we will encourage them to at least providing a central kind of egress route and then all around the premises as well. So, but not necessarily between each table or each chair you need to have that egress route. Just basically, I think it's just rule of thumb and common sense applies. Whether if you are in that situation, can you still go out? Really, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Any other questions at this point? There we go. Over there.
Sorry, Angela, I've got another question for you. Just like you to clarify one of the points you brought up with AS4, just about the seating on flat floor.
Yep.
Quite often in what we do, on a flat floor we make tiered seating, temporary tiered seating, like say for a choir or even for audience to be able to see the stage that we've built. Just want to clarify the number of seats and the interconnected seats that you mentioned on.
250.
So is it 250 or more?
Once 250 and more.
Okay.
Then you need to have interconnected.
So we were doing a small tiered seating for say 100 people.
Yep.
The seats don't need to be interconnected?
No.
Cool. Thank you.
Excellent.
Unpopular.
You're very popular today.
Another question for you. If a director, from an artistic point of view, wants to have a totally dark theatre at the beginning of a show,
Yep.
and they want the emergency lights switched off, is that actually permitted or not? Or is that something that has to be managed? Or from an artistic point of view, they might want it black, but from a safety point of view,
actually quite common.
Yep.
It's a gray area. It doesn't really specifically say, but I think that's part of the evacuation scheme side of things. Like you can go and talk to the fire service as well to get an understanding. But if you're temporarily going to dim the lights, then the recommendation is you definitely need to have more people to help directing the egress if anything goes wrong. Yeah. And it really depends on the type of show you have as well. What's the fire hazard involving to that show? So it's so very hard to judge from just one.
We've got a question here for Anthony. Excuse my paper, it's actually real. So in terms of the non-pyrotechnic options, so you mentioned about obviously pyrotechnic requires licensing. What sort of skill base and licensing or education is required for the non-pyrotechnic options if people want to go down that route?
There aren't any actual qualifications required for instance, using fire in theatres that I know of. I've seen a number of theatrical productions in which they've just looked at the safety aspects, but there was no actual specifications or legislation to follow. I may be corrected on that whether there is an expression of naked flame in the theatre or naked light in the theatre, whether that there are some legislative requirements, but I have never seen them brought up at all.
Awesome, thank you. Good to know. Boz. Thank you.
Angela, you spoke before about isolation of audience from stage in terms of a smoke stop or a fire curtain. For, I think, venues you mentioned over 500.
Yep.
We're obviously aware here in Christchurch we have a 1,500-seater theatre that doesn't have a smoke stop curtain or a fire curtain. It is sprinklered, and I believe the James Hay Theatre is heading in that direction as well. I just wonder if you had any thoughts around that. I mean, it's clearly an engineered space.
What I presented is the current requirement under CAS4. So obviously over the years, the requirement has changed. So I don't know how old is those buildings and what's the regulations when they was built. So maybe it was compliant at that time, but if you're doing any major renovation to the building, if you're required to have a building consent, then you might run into problem. So you might be required to board up to the current standard. Yeah.
Awesome. Alrighty. Dean, your turn. You can't go get away unscathed on this. You mentioned about the no necessary requirement for sets, etc., to be fireproofed. Is it possible to fireproof basic sets, and more so things like cardboard and the likes? I'm thinking in a school environment where they may do homemade props that are not quite professionally made props that may need to be considered. What's some thoughts around that?
Absolutely. When I said there's no legislation, that's as in the way the building code dictates with the fabrics, but as for sets, cardboards and papers, all of those sorts of things, And I forget what it's called now, but the smoke-free rock quest that they have, the school talent quest that they have a blanket rule that all of their sets need to be flame retardant. And they've, over the years, educated the teachers and the people involved in teaching their students and building the sets not to use products like polystyrene and core flute and things that they used to see all the time, but cardboards and papers and anything. You know, we do get asked that a lot is because they're having a big light right next to a paper mache rock or something like that. So yeah, they definitely can be done for an added protection. Absolutely.
Excellent. Okay, got nothing coming off the web stream yet any further at the moment, so.
Yeah, I've got another one for Dean. You mentioned the flammability index 12. Is there anywhere where you can find information that states what other particular materials, such as say plywood, and that has a flammability index that is, so you can compare it? Does that make sense?
So you're talking between different materials?
Yeah. So that if you're making something out of plywood and it's got a flammability index of X, and you're making something out of MDF, it's got a flammability index of something.
They are different. Flammability index applies to the AS 1530 Part 2 test, and it's for that particular material. Timbers and other products have different tests that they go through and different ratings. They have smoke development and spread of flame and so forth from there, but that comes down to, again, when you're talking to fire engineers about what requirements are for if they're using them in egress and whether they're attached to as part of your wall or ceiling, and under flexible fabrics, your building paper and that comes in as well, and it has a lower index again of 5. Things like marquees and tents, they all are considered a flexible fabric, and they are 12 as well, and they come under that thing. So it really depends on where it is and where it's at. For fabrics, majority of good fabrics, we've got literally hundreds of different tests on different types of fabrics, but a lot of your suppliers, if they're going into, they generally supply into venues that are being used, or producers that produce products that are being used in public places of assembly, would have had to have gone through these tests, because otherwise you're not selling something that's fit for purpose. So if we're selling a Trevera or a wool or a velour, particular brand, and even down to colours, we can pull a test report out and say, well, that's what it is naturally, that's what it is with the application of a fire retardant on it, that's what it is after 5 years, or accelerated cleaning and so forth from there.
Alrighty, got one for Angela. So you've been very popular tonight with your questions, that's good. So you mentioned we do often put draping and stage elements and so on in front of exits. If we are covering an exit entirely and it requires the action of a drape to be opened or moved to enable that exit, is that okay? And what sort of considerations might we need to do to enable that to fit within our fire requirements?
I think that falls again to kind of gray area as well, because under the evacuation regulations, you're supposed to maintain egress route at all times. But for theater, which is a bit different, we understand that. So in this kind of situation, if you have to block it temporarily, then you need to think of what's the mitigation that you can put in. One way is potentially to have people standing next to the door. If there's any confirmed emergency, just open that curtain. Or, I don't know, you know.
Can I, just with the curtain side of things, we've been involved several times where we've been required to cover up windows and exits and so forth, and we've had exemptions where fire engineers and the council have approved even having a permanent curtain there, but the curtain has to, we've had to sew in a light reactive strip so they can see the separation, and they've often brought a low light fire exit sign in front of the curtain and that as well. So whenever there's any doubt, the best form you can do is talk to people like these and your local council, and that they're more than willing to help, because the last thing they want to see is you block an exit and something happen and so forth. But you can get, there are exemptions to a lot of rules if you just inquire, and what they want to know is how are you going to mitigate anything that could potentially happen.
All right, so we've just had a, thank you very much, Grant. We've had a question off the net. Who approves an evacuation scheme? So if we had to make it, okay, cool. So just to clarify for anyone who missed that, New Zealand Fire Service rebranded earlier on this year as Fire and Emergency New Zealand. So it's got a new name. So it's not a different company to play with. That's good. That's cool. Thank you. So Angela's other role, when she's not representing the Institution of Fire Architects, she works as for Fire and Emergency New Zealand here in Christchurch.
Department that approves evacuation scheme though. So.
Nice, excellent. I've got, oh yeah, excellent, good, I like that.
Hi Angela, another question. Specifically to do with festivals and pop-up venues. So if you're using a venue which isn't necessarily approved initially as a performance venue, what would be the process to follow to get an evacuation scheme approved? Do you need to do that? How many people would need to be in the audience before you would need to do that, and so on?
If your gathering has more than 100 people, it doesn't matter if it's a one-off event or a constant event. Under the regulation, you actually need to apply for evacuation scheme. And the evacuation scheme is generally to be applied by the building owner, but you could actually assign it or dedicate it to your agent. So most commonly, it's actually applied by the evacuation consultant. So you can dedicate it to your engage your evacuation consultant, and they can come to talk to the fire service to see what's the best way to arrange egress.
And what's the time frame involved in
legally, they will need to reply within 20 days, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question for Angela. How do you work out, say if you've got a set room that's, I don't know, 5 metres by 5 metres, how do you work out what's the maximum capacity you can have for that room before you start becoming a danger?
In terms of the egress, or sorry?
In terms of egress, yeah.
Okay.
Is there a set rule, or?
So if your space has 5 meter by 5 meter.
At a guess, yes.
Okay, so it depends on what kind of events you have within that space. Say, for example, if you use it for standing venue, for like bars or something, then obviously it's more dense. Then the calculation rule is 1 meter square per person. That's how many people going to be inside that room. If you're going to have like loose seating kind of arrangements, I think if from memory is 2 meters square per person or something. That's actually a table in CS4 that you can download and have a look in detail. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's what I need to know.
Okay.
Excellent. All right, we'll wrap it up with one more question, which I'll address to all three of you. So what do you perceive as the biggest issue or hurdle that we're facing as an industry in the entertainment technology at the moment? What one thing would you like to see us overcome in the near future moving forward? Anthony, we'll start with you.
Oh, I was wondering who was going to answer that amazing question.
Well, I reckon all three. I reckon use your prediction. That's your prediction. So.
What I would see is that the Ministry for the Environment writes the regulations for dangerous goods. And I don't know where they get their information from, but they make some amazing stuff-ups. And I refer to particularly saying that you cannot use indoor pyro outdoors except if you use it at outdoor safety distances. So I could hand this lady a sparkler indoors and she would be fine, but I'd have to have it 25 metres away from her outdoors. That's what the regulations said. And it took 5 years to sort that one out. What I would like to see is a far more effective way of getting information from the field, from knowledgeable practitioners into the regulatory system. And I think that actually works really well with the fire regulations because it's a very practical subject, but the Ministry for the Environment really do make life difficult because WorkSafe actually can't question the regulations really.
Excellent, thank you very much. Dean?
And it is changing in my view over the years, but it's the same old attitude of we've done it like this for 30 years, Why should we do it like this now, or why do we have to do it like this now with the influx of all the new health and safety and knowledge that people have now? I guess there is still some of that old attitude out there that should be right, mate, and that's what causes accidents, and that's what gets people hurt. It's the whole thing of it's like hanging stuff with number 8 wire and binder twine. I still see it every other day of the week in little rural theatres and school venues, and you know, they bring in volunteers, and the guy says, well, we've been doing it like this for 30 years. I guess it's just it's a continuing thing like this, is the education that's coming forth now, and the knowledge with the likes of ETNZ and the different organisations are really promoting the health and safety and the education, and you know, what was done in the past is not necessarily the best way to do it now, and I am seeing it change, but there is still quite a bit of that attitude out there.
Thank you.
For me, I guess it's communication. It's not necessarily just for performance venue, it's for general design field. The communication between the building owner, operators, and the designer, fire engineers or evacuation consultants, exactly what the space is going to be used for. Because in a lot of cases, we've seen fire engineers putting in detection systems that's not necessarily fit for purpose for that venue. Or sometimes the fire engineer and the evacuation consultant assume different things and put in different strategies in their reports, but then it's for the same building. So I think communication is quite important. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. And I think we've all seen that communication is important and is growing in its benefit, especially with around consultation in the new Health and Safety Act. So the more people are talking, the less interdepartmental screw-ups we're seeing, hopefully, touch wood, possibly. Is there any more, Grant? Nope, that's it. All right. So I'd like to thank very much Angela, Dean and Anthony for presenting for us tonight. We've got a wee gift for you guys. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Alrighty. So just to briefly wrap up, so our new membership tiers that we talked about at conference are now live. So any new members that join up to ETNZ from now on will join under the new structure. As part of that, we've got our free membership, which is pretty much a good newsletter, but it's a good newsletter, and it's helping to disseminate information and getting the industry talking to each other and see what's going on. So encourage people to go onto the ETNZ website and sign up for our Coal membership. It's particularly good for your freelance staff members and your employees or the people that you're working with, just so they can see what's going on, get some first-hand information and stimulate conversation. So get them along there, and also get them to sign up for and follow Facebook, our Facebook stream. Yeah, the more we're getting people talking about stuff, the more people are engaging, and we can help grow what we're doing. So thank you very much for coming along tonight. It's been awesome. It's been great to have another discussion. Again, thank you to our presenters, and thanks to the Court Theatre for having us. So excellent. The bar's open and there's a hell of a lot of confetti to clean up, so don't run away. Cheers for that.